The US state of Alabama has carried out the first known execution of a death row inmate by suffocation with nitrogen gas. Kenneth Smith, a convicted murderer, was put to death after the Supreme Court again denied a last-minute appeal.
What does it feel like when the method of your death has never been used on a living human being before? On January 25th, 2024, Kenneth Eugene Smith woke up inside Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama, fully aware he would not live to see another dawn. But this wasn't a typical execution. This time, the state had chosen something new, a method never tested on a prisoner before. And yet, in those final moments, something unexpected happened. One small moment would shift everything, and when the time finally came, the world watched closely. But what was Kenneth really thinking that day? Did he feel fear, peace, or something else entirely? This is the final 24 hours of Kenneth Eugene Smith. Before his name was tied to headlines, lawsuits, and a controversial execution, Kenneth Eugene Smith was just a boy growing up in the American South. Born in Alabama in 1965, Kenneth's childhood wasn't marked by notoriety or violence. By most accounts, his early years were unremarkable, not privileged, but not especially troubled either. He was raised in a working-class home, one of several children in a large family. School wasn't a strong suit for him. He struggled to keep up and eventually dropped out before graduating high school. Like many in his community, Kenneth drifted toward manual labor and odd jobs, construction work, landscaping, whatever paid the bills. But by his late teens and early 20s, things started to change. He became restless, fell in with the wrong crowd, and began racking up arrests, mostly for theft and burglary. He was never seen as especially violent, more of a follower than a leader, someone who acted impulsively and struggled with direction. But that sense of aimlessness would one day lead him straight into a murder-for-hire plot that would change everything. And once it happened, there would be no turning back. By the time Kenneth Eugene met Reverend Charles Sennett, his life had already drifted into dangerous waters. Smith was barely 22, was known around North Alabama for petty crimes, but nothing that would foreshadow what was coming. It all began with the Reverend himself. Charles Sennett Sr. was the pastor of the Church of Christ in Sheffield, Alabama. He was also deeply in debt, tangled in an extramarital affair, and desperate to find a way out. But instead of divorce, he chose something far more final: murder. He didn't plan to get his hands dirty. He turned to one of his tenants, Billy Gray Williams, and offered him a job: kill his wife, Elizabeth Sennett, for money. Williams accepted, but he wasn't going to do it alone. That's where Kenneth Eugene Smith entered the picture. Williams recruited Smith and another young man, John Forrest Parker, to carry out the killing. The payout? $1,000 each. Smith and Parker agreed. They were given money up front, allegedly to purchase a gun. But instead of buying a weapon, the men spent the money on drugs. The plan was still in motion, but now it would be carried out with improvised weapons and raw violence. On the morning of March 18th, Smith and Parker drove to the Sennett residence in Colbert County, Alabama. They had been told to pose as hunters, interested in using the family's land for sport. When Elizabeth Sennett answered the door, she was wary, so she phoned her husband, the very man who had ordered her death. Charles told her to let the men inside. That was the last decision she would ever make freely. Once inside, Smith and Parker bided their time. One asked to use the restroom. Then, with chilling calculation, the assault began. The two didn't have a gun, so they used whatever they could find in the house. Smith struck first, beating Elizabeth with a fireplace tool, then a walking cane, and later a galvanized pipe. She tried to fight back. She screamed. She begged. Parker joined in, and the two overwhelmed her. Then Smith pulled out a 6-inch survival knife. He stabbed her 8 times, delivering the fatal wounds. Elizabeth didn't die immediately. When Sheriff Ronnie May arrived, he couldn't find a pulse, but paramedics did. She was barely alive. When they told Charles Sennett, her husband, that she had a pulse, he reportedly almost collapsed. Elizabeth died at the hospital, and what followed would reveal just how cold and calculated the entire plan had been. From the very beginning, the scene looked staged. The Sennett's home had signs of a break-in, but something felt off. The intruders had taken only a VCR and a stereo. It looked more like theater than theft. Then came the break. An anonymous tip came through Crime Stoppers naming names: Kenneth Smith and John Parker. When detectives searched Smith's home, they found it, the VCR taken from the Sennett's house. It was undeniable evidence. Smith was arrested, and so was Parker. Under pressure, both men talked. They described the entire plan, how Charles Sennett had set it all up, how they were hired, how Elizabeth was beaten and stabbed, every brutal detail. But the man who hired them, Charles, wasn't going to face justice. On March 25th, just 7 days after the murder, investigators brought Reverend Sennett in for questioning. He denied everything, but when someone in the room asked if he knew Kenneth Smith, his face flushed red. After the interview, Charles went to his church. He gathered his sons and their families, and there, in a moment of grim confession, he admitted everything: the affair, the plan, and the murder. Then he walked to his truck, sat inside, and shot himself in the head. The mastermind was gone. But Kenneth Eugene Smith, the man who carried out the violence, remained. Kenneth Eugene Smith's trial was anything but straightforward. In his first trial, the evidence against Smith was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty of the cold-blooded murder, but when it came time to decide his fate, the jury was split. 10 jurors voted for the death penalty, 2 for life imprisonment. Under Alabama law at the time, for cases before 2017, the jury's sentencing recommendation carried significant weight but wasn't final. The judge had the ultimate authority and was expected to seriously consider the jury's vote. In 1989, the judge sentenced Smith to death, setting in motion the wheels of capital punishment. However, this was not the end. Smith's conviction and death sentence were overturned on appeal in 1992, sending the case back to court for a second trial. The reasons for the appeal centered on procedural and legal errors during the first trial, offering Smith a new chance. In the second trial, the jury appeared more reluctant to send Smith to the execution chamber. This time, 11 jurors recommended a life sentence, with only 1 juror voting for death. Yet, the judge again overruled this majority recommendation, imposing the death penalty on Smith in 1996. Meanwhile, John Forrest Parker, Smith's accomplice in the murder, was also sentenced to death. Billy Gray Williams, the man who hired them, received life imprisonment without parole. Years later, Parker would be executed by lethal injection in 2010, closing his chapter. Williams died in prison quietly in 2020 from illness. And for Smith, the date was set on the evening of November 17th, 2022. That evening, Kenneth Eugene Smith was taken to the execution chamber. Despite a legal stay pending in court, prison officials began preparations, and Smith was shackled to the gurney. Just 2 minutes after Smith was brought in, the 11th Circuit Court issued a stay of execution. However, Smith was not immediately informed and remained strapped down as the team tried to insert the IV for the lethal injection. Around 10:20 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the stay, allowing the execution to proceed, but complications arose. Prison staff struggled to find a suitable vein. Smith was moved into an awkward position, and attempts to inject the drugs failed. He was visibly distressed, sweating and unable to move properly. After nearly an hour of difficulties, the execution was called off. Smith was spared, but the failed attempt exposed serious problems in Alabama's execution process. Following this, the governor ordered a review, and changes were made to give more time for carrying out executions in the future. For Smith, death had come close but slipped away. After the failed execution attempt in November 2022, the state quickly moved to set a new date. On August 29, 2023, Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall petitioned the Supreme Court to schedule Kenneth Eugene Smith's second execution. This time, the state sought to use nitrogen hypoxia, a method never before used in any execution worldwide. The court approved setting an execution date for November 3rd, but the governor later postponed it, ordering the execution to take place on January 25, 2024 by nitrogen gas. So what does it feel like to wake up and know the state has scheduled your death not once, but twice? For Kenneth Eugene Smith, the second date felt different, not just because time was running out, but because the method was something no human had ever endured before. An untested, unproven execution method that promised a so-called peaceful death by replacing oxygen with nitrogen, but no one had ever seen it done. No doctor had ever witnessed its effects on a human being in an execution chamber. His lawyers begged the courts to intervene, not just because nitrogen hypoxia was untested, but because he had already suffered once. They argued, how could the state try again after failing the first time? But the courts didn't agree. For Kenneth Eugene Smith, the countdown to his execution had truly begun. And this time, the state intended to finish what it started. It was the final day, January 25th, 2024. Inside Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility, the air felt colder than usual. Kenneth Eugene Smith had lived through one execution attempt already. And now, as the sun rose on this Thursday morning, he knew there would be no delay this time. At exactly 6 in the morning, the guards switched shifts and the routine began. Smith had been placed on death watch, meaning he was under constant observation. 2 officers stood just outside his cell, eyes fixed on him. No moment went unrecorded. Smith was already awake. There had been no restful sleep. For weeks, nausea and anxiety had robbed him of rest. The trauma of the failed execution attempt still lived in his body. He suffered from retching, sleepless nights, and a quiet fear that this second time would be worse. Now, as the countdown began again, that trauma settled into his bones. His movements were slow, his shoulders heavy. At 10 o'clock sharp, Smith's final meal was served. Not dinner, not lunch, breakfast. This decision was made to minimize the risk of vomiting, to reduce the chance that the execution by nitrogen hypoxia would become chaotic or cruel. The state insisted this was a precaution. His attorneys called it another act of inhumanity. The tray was placed inside the cell. Steak, hash browns, and eggs. It was not a large meal, and it was not symbolic. It was calculated, served 8 hours before the scheduled execution, with all liquids cut off after 4 in the afternoon. Smith didn't touch the food right away. For a while, he just stared at the tray in silence. Then, without a word, he began to eat, carefully, slowly. There were no visitors beside him, no family or friends to share this moment, just the food and the guards and the clock ticking forward. This wasn't about satisfying hunger, it was about procedure. Some inmates eat their last meal surrounded by family, in visitation rooms with vending machine snacks and brief smiles. Smith ate alone, inside his cell, with only the scratch of a pen from the officers, logging every detail, the time, the contents, the person who served it. Later that morning, he was given the opportunity to write a final will and go over basic legal procedures. His lawyers, deeply familiar with the emotional terrain of a last day, were nearby but not yet summoned. The warden's team noted every item on the tray, the time it was served, how much he ate. Everything logged, everything controlled. Smith didn't say much. He moved slowly. At times he closed his eyes and leaned against the wall, not asleep, just suspended in thought. Outside, the prison grounds were quiet. Inside, the weight was building. By midday, the silence around Kenneth Eugene Smith had deepened. The breakfast tray was long gone. The guards were still stationed outside his cell, watching, but even their footsteps had grown quieter, more hesitant. Everyone inside Holman Correctional Facility seemed to feel the same invisible weight pressing down. The hour was getting close. In the early afternoon, Smith received his final visit. He was allowed 9 visitors. His wife came first, then his sons, grown now but still his children in that moment. The conversation between them was quiet, emotional. There was no rush, but there was no time to waste either. They didn't speak much about the execution. There were no last-minute questions, no desperate attempts to change anything, just presence, tears, small, hard-earned moments of peace. His wife reached through the bars. Their hands met briefly, one last connection after decades of pain, legal battles, and years of waiting for this day that none of them wanted. The sons didn't say much either. Sometimes love, in moments like these, is shown not through words, but simply by showing up and staying. Once the visit ended, the corridor returned to quiet. Then came Reverend Jeff Hood. For months, Reverend Hood had stood by Smith as an advisor, as a friend, and now in this final stretch, as the only person who could be near him when everything was taken away. The two men spoke softly. Hood later said Smith was afraid, not of death itself, but of what this method might bring. The unknown hung heavy in the air, but despite the fear, Smith had reached something close to acceptance. Hood said he had made peace, that his spirit had settled, that even though the state was asking him to die by a method no one had tested, Kenneth Eugene Smith had found a way to let go. He sat quietly for the rest of the afternoon inside that observation cell, just steps away from the execution chamber. A few last prayers, a few deep breaths. The hours ticked down. The door remained closed, but time was moving. Outside the prison walls, protests were growing louder. Across the nation, people were debating the ethics of what was coming. But inside that cell, there was only one man, and the final stretch of daylight he would ever see. As the clock inched toward evening, the world focused on a single room inside Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility. For Kenneth Eugene Smith, this was the last chapter of a long, brutal story. He spoke briefly on the phone. He wore his wedding ring and a calm expression that masked the deeper truth, fear, reflection, and the weight of being history's first test subject in a nitrogen gas execution. At 7:47 in the evening, the 5 media witnesses, including a representative from AL.com, were escorted from a trailer into the viewing room. 4 of Smith's own chosen witnesses were already there: his wife, his son, his lawyer, and a close friend. His wife wore a shirt that read, "Never Alone." At 7:53, the curtain rose. Smith was already strapped to the gurney, his chest slightly elevated. His arms were spread and restrained, and a white sheet covered him up to the chest. He looked toward the glass and locked eyes with his family. He smiled, nodded, gave a thumbs up, and even signed, "I love you," with his left hand. The moment was surreal. The room was quiet. Then the warden entered and read the death warrant. Smith spoke into the microphone, his voice muffled through the mask strapped to his face. But his message was clear. He said Alabama had caused humanity to take a step backward, referencing his failed execution attempt from the previous year. He said he had seen compassion rise in the aftermath of his suffering, And now, as his voice trembled through the mask, he told the room and the world that he was leaving with love, peace, and light. The microphone was removed. His spiritual advisor stepped forward and touched Smith's feet with his Bible, whispering blessings and marking his body with the sign of the cross. Smith kept looking toward his family, still smiling. Then, at 7:58, the nitrogen gas began to flow. The room watched as Smith's body began to shake. His arms thrashed against the restraints, and he writhed on the gurney for about 2 minutes. His chest rose and fell violently. Then came 7 long minutes of heavy breathing, gasps for air that would not come. His wife cried out. The room tensed. At 8:01, a correctional officer leaned over Smith, examining his face. By 8:08, he appeared to stop breathing. The curtain was closed at 8:15. 10 minutes later, at 8:25, a physician pronounced Kenneth Eugene Smith dead. Outside, families and reporters stood in silence. Some called it justice. Others said it was torture. Inside, Smith had become the first human being in history to die by nitrogen gas. In the hours after Kenneth Eugene Smith's execution, his body was transported to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences for an autopsy. What the examiners found raised alarm. Smith's lungs were swollen and filled with fluid. His blood was described as dark maroon, a sign of severe oxygen deprivation. A foamy substance coated his trachea, and his airways showed signs of intense congestion. The cause of death was consistent with what's called negative pressure pulmonary edema. It is a phenomenon that can occur when a person panics during suffocation, involuntarily gasping against a sealed airway. In simple terms, he drowned in his own bodily fluids, gasping for air that would never come. This was not how death was supposed to look in a controlled setting. Months later, Carrie Dale Grayson, another Alabama inmate scheduled for nitrogen hypoxia, had an expert review Smith's autopsy. That expert called the findings highly concerning. The medical analysis suggested Smith likely panicked in his final moments, not because of emotional fear, but due to a primal, involuntary reaction to oxygen deprivation. One anesthesiologist even argued that had Smith been sedated, this panic and the resulting trauma might have been avoided. But Alabama didn't stop. Instead, Smith's execution opened the door for more. Within months, Ohio lawmakers began pushing to adopt nitrogen hypoxia as a legal method of execution. So, what do you think? Should states be allowed to experiment with untested methods on real people? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts, no matter where you stand. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories, and ask yourself, if the punishment looks like suffering, is it still justice? Thanks for watching.